Weiner was first called West Prairie. The immediate area was not wooded, but was indeed a prairie surrounded by woods, as is evidenced in this photo. The sawmill on the left was located just south of where the rice dryer is today. The cross ties lined up by the railroad tracks would be picked up and moved to complete the railroad further south. The wealth of timber in the area provided income for settlers. A Mr. Weiner was a construction engineer and an overseer in the building of the railroad. He was so well liked that when the depot was built, the residents decided to name the depot after him. Travelers coming to the area never said they were going to West Prairie, but to Weiner, which was the depot where they got off. The name stuck. Today, when residents vote, they still are voting in West Prairie, but the town is still called Weiner. Miss Leila Lynch is credited with writing a history of the town. Her father, James Lynch, came from Tennessee and started a mercantile business here in 1886. In 1891, he was the postmaster. Miss Leila was born in 1893 and was raised by her grandparents after her parents died. She was active in the community and gave piano lessons for a number of years. Miss Leila wrote the first history of the area, which began as a pamphlet. She later expanded it into Through the Years in Weiner, Arkansas. Grace Sentney also wrote a history that deals primarily with growing up in this area. It dates from the early 1900s and tells much about homesteading. The Friendly Garden Club was a group of ladies who were very active in the community. One project was a newsletter they created for servicemen during World War II. The newsletter was mailed monthly to those overseas. This is a copy of the front page of one of those newsletters. As servicemen began writing back to the ladies of the Garden Club, thanking them and telling what was happening where they were located, the ladies typed those letters and included them in the next newsletter. This made it possible for area servicemen to know what was happening to each other. The first settlers there is a record of were the John P. Phillips family, who came by ox wagon from Macon, Georgia in 1866. At that time, the state was making a real effort to attract homesteaders to northeast Arkansas. After reading an article in the newspaper, the family loaded up the trunk, said goodbye to family and friends, and headed out looking for a better life. They settled 1.5 miles west of Weiner. John became the postmaster for the new settlement, and the trunk housed the settlement's mail. However, another of those first settlers who came to the area became feared. According to Miss Lynch's book, Joe Bruner was the epitome of all that was evil. It is suspected that he was responsible for the deaths of his 4 children. His story has become legend in the area. During Bruner's lifetime, mothers often told their own children that if they didn't behave, they would be given to old Bruner. The graves of John Phillips and those early settlers are located at what today is called the Bruner Cemetery. The reason for the name is the Bruner graves are the only ones that had stone markers. Somewhere among the indentations lies the resting place of John Phillips and his wife. The wooden crosses that once marked their location have long since disappeared. Today the cemetery is known by few, hidden away in a dense grove of trees. This is a copy of a very old photograph showing a man standing next to a felled tree. Although the Weiner area itself was a prairie, the surrounding woods contained enormous trees. The trees were so big, in fact, that the first settlers to the area found it necessary to dig and expose the roots, chopping away at the root system. Eventually, the root system would not be able to support the tree. Sawmilling was the chief industry from the time the railroad was built until the introduction of rice. The first trees cut were what is called virgin timber, trees that had grown for centuries, free from those who had felled them. The diameter of the trunks of those trees was wider than a man was tall. Eventually, the town shifted from the location of the Phillips settlement, which was just west of Weiner, and grew up near the location of the new railroad being built. The rough timber not used by the railroad company became the material for businesses and homes, giving the town an Old West look. The good lumber was used only on the front. As more and more people moved into the area, more businesses arrived. There were drugstores, dress shops, general stores, and at one time even a saloon. People came into town on Saturday to do their business and visit. The main area of town in those early years was on the south side of Kings Highway near the railroad tracks. This entire side of town burned one night around the year 1930. The building on the left was Thompson's Livery and Feed Barn. Much of this building was later rented during the winter months to those with automobiles. In the winter, the roads were nearly impassable. Finally, the Frys opened a theater in the south portion of the building using a second-hand projector. There was a very small lobby and ticket booth. The floor sloped down toward the screen, and the seats were crude benches. Bags of roasted peanuts were sold. After the showing of each reel, the lights were turned on, and the new reel threaded. The home on the right of the photograph is the Huber home. In the early 1920s, a Mr. Applegate showed up in town, loaded with musical instruments. He told the people that if they would purchase the instruments, he would stay and teach them to play. And he did. Music became an important part of the community. Several businesses, including the hotel, were located west of the railroad tracks on the north side of town. The Downing and Hogue Mercantile advertised dealers in what you want. The local chapter of the International Order of Oddfellows met regularly on the second floor. Change was a constant, even in those early years. You can still see the hotel, but notice the new businesses that have been added. The town had a huge wooden water tank to supply water for the steam locomotives that came through regularly. Rail was the main mode of travel. Trains all had passenger cars. Many of the early photographs of the town were taken from the top of this water tank. Even in the early years, sports figured into our community. Sunday afternoons were times for families to gather and cheer for Weiner's local baseball team. In the early part of 1899, the men and women of Weiner met to discuss ways to build a church. All services were held in the school. It was decided to build a union church to be used by any denomination. A ladies' aid society was organized, and this group devised ways to raise money for construction of the church, everything from suppers to plays. The church was completed in the spring of 1900, and a dedication service was held. Ladies raised money for a church bell and an organ. No pastor was available at first, but occasionally a preacher would hear of the Weiner Church and hold a meeting. The church was torn down in 1950 and the land purchased by Mr. and Mrs. Sonny Winters. Today, there are many churches in the Weiner area. This old photograph shows a Union Church baptism service. This is what was then Church Street, but today is West 3rd Street. The photo shows another view of the Union Church, which was located approximately 2 blocks west of the railroad tracks. The house on the left corner is the Leela Lynch home, which is still standing and is just north of the library. During the years when wood heat was used and all structures were built of wood, fire was common. The means to put out those fires was minimal. 2 Catholic churches burned prior to the building of the current brick church. This photograph was taken just north of Weiner and is remarkable because of the man in the middle. In the mid-1920s, Charles Lindbergh landed on the north edge of town with several other planes. One of the planes was experiencing problems. The open prairie provided the perfect landing spot and gave Weiner residents a close-up look not only at the planes, but Mr. Lindbergh as well. Weiner resident Grace Dinsmore may well have been the first liberated woman in Arkansas. In an era when a woman's place was indisputably in the home, Miss Dinsmore opened a movie theater and a photography studio. She developed her own photographs, and many a Weiner resident had their photograph taken standing by her wicker chair. Grace Dinsmore heated the majestic movie theater with a big pot-belly stove that in the winter was always hungry for more wood. Keeping a stack of needed wood was a problem until she came up with the perfect plan. The price of admission for children at the popular Saturday matinee would be a stick of wood. Kids looked forward to those matinees, and all was well until Grace discovered that many kids were simply getting a stick of wood from her woodpile in the back of the building and using it for their price of admission. Not to be outdone, she began marking the end of each wooden ticket with a big white X, which seemed to solve the problem. Miss Dinsmore was popular with a group of girls who often attended the movies and would sometimes spend the night. Grace lived behind the theater. Her photography studio was also in the same building. One night, during one of these girls' night out parties, Grace posed the girls and took this photograph. Of course, color film had not been invented yet, so she colorized the image. Typically, this was done by painting the negative. This photograph shows the Weiner Depot that became the reason for the name change from West Prairie to Weiner. At Gilmore's barber shop, haircuts were 50 cents and a shave was 25 cents. Often, men coming into town on Saturday evenings used Harry's shower room to clean up after a day in the field. The business section of town was the hub of the community. Residents purchased most everything they needed locally. From 1870 until the 1900s, livestock was marked or branded by the owners and ran free in the countryside and woods. This was a temptation for dishonest persons, and consequently, there were hog and cattle thieves roaming the countryside in secluded places. Cattle thieves were dealt with by the locals, but punishment was typically not severe. Sometimes a single cow was stolen specifically for food. In 1881, when construction began on the railroad, many settlers were fearful the trains would kill their livestock. This photograph shows a cattle drive coming right down what is now Highway 49 in the main part of Weiner. Many remember the old Bayou Bridge for a variety of reasons. The huge iron structure and the clippity-clap of the boards on the one-lane expanse both frightened and excited many a child riding the back end of Dad's pickup. In addition to their World War II newspaper, the Weiner Friendly Garden Club actively worked at beautifying the town, as evidenced in this photograph. There were many small schools that sprang up in the early 1900s as homesteaders looked for ways to educate their children. The first school, located where today's Weiner School is, was called the Scott Rayburn School. It was also the first name of the settlement. In 1915, a new brick school replaced the old wooden structure. A gymnasium was built in 1930. In 1939, there were 271 students in Weiner School. The following schools eventually became part of the Weiner District: Beautiful Home, MoMA, Cooper and Haynes, Harmony Grove, the Redmond School, Yukonaw, Waldenburg School, Fisher School, and eventually the Catholic School. Today, most of these first structures are all gone. The celebration of May Day was held each year during those early years. It involved the traditional maypole, something not done anymore. This photograph was taken on the east side of the old brick school building. The first class graduated from Weiner Public School in 1916. We remember Beautiful Home, west of Weiner, near Bayou de Vue. The Momi School, about 3 miles north of Weiner. Cooper and Haynes, west of Weiner, as they say, across the bayou. Harmony Grove, just southwest of Weiner. Yukonaw, just south of Waldenburg. Long Creek, just west of Cooper and Haynes. Taps School, west of Waldenburg. Waldenburg School, just east of the Lutheran Church in Waldenburg. The Fisher School, west of the railroad tracks in Fisher. The Catholic School. This early photograph of the campus shows the Weiner Gymnasium on the left. The rich basketball tradition began early in the school's history, providing fans a chance to get together and cheer on the Weiner Cardinals. Many wonderful teachers have worked with Weiner students over the years. This prom photograph shows a group of girls with Leonard Smith, who sponsored many senior classes. Henry Wilson, who taught English for years, was another memorable teacher, who was known to water artificial flowers when students were present. He is pictured here with Ruth Lynn. Each and every graduating class had their group photograph taken in front of the two-story school. The architecture of the old Weiner Elementary building was somewhat stark. It was built, as so many schools were during that time, through the WPA project from the federal government. This photograph shows the dismantling of the top story of the old school. The first floor continued to be used for a number of years until it too was torn down. In 1904, the Bradford and Etchison brick store burned. Eventually, a new store was built on the site of the former one and was covered with galvanized iron on both the roof and walls. Franklin Huber bought the store from the Ross in 1919. He and his wife, Mary, stayed in business until the early 1940s. Mr. Huber kept chickens penned up behind his store. He definitely claimed to have the freshest chickens available. The building is still standing today. Fowler's store operated in a two-story brick building that is also still standing. Mr. Fowler had everything from food to caskets to fabric. At Christmas time, Mr. Fowler had toys in the top floor of the store to help Santa's helpers who couldn't get to Jonesboro. Weiner had an abundance of gas stations. At one time, there were 5 or 6, and no one pumped their own gas. The theater was eventually renamed the Victory Theater after the war. Ritz Espy ran the theater during the 50s. During segregation, African Americans were forced to sit upstairs. Grundon's, which was located west of Highway 49 just before Otwell, was a popular spot in the 1930s and 1940s. In the 1950s, Grundon's was still open, but closed in the latter part of that decade. Mr. Grundon kept what was actually a large pond full of fresh, cool, running well water. On the northwest corner of the pond was a large building over the water that contained dressing rooms and a dance floor. A person could even rent a bathing suit if he or she wished, which was laundered and then rented again. On weekends, teenagers loved to gather, put coins in the jukebox, and shake a leg. There were even drinks and snacks for sale, nothing alcoholic. Several people talked about getting the best hamburger they ever had at Grundon's. The pool included a high diving board with 2 heights to challenge even the most daring swimmer. There were also 2 large, connected, screened-in areas to swim in, located in the deep water. One of these had a taller roof that accommodated another high diving board inside. A swimmer could go under the water and come up inside. This kept the pesky mosquitoes away when going for a night swim. Grundon's just may have been home to the first water slide. Swimmers would actually ride down the slide on a sled that was on a track, hit the water, skim across the top, and then go under. The sled then came back up the track, ready for the next rider. Extreme sports may actually have begun at Grundon's. Climbing a tall steel derrick brought the reward of a ride on the zip line down into the water. So small children wouldn't feel left out, Grundon's had what looked like a small Ferris wheel in the water. Many a mother spent many a minute turning that crank. Grundon's was the place to go on the 4th of July. Everyone from miles around brought a picnic lunch and spread a blanket under the trees to hold their spot. Often special entertainment would be featured on the 4th. Grundon's closed in the early 1960s. Hunting was both a sport and a necessity in the earliest days of the West Prairie settlement. Mrs. Molly Clark Pickett, sister of Tom Phillips, told me many years ago that when they first came to Arkansas from Alabama, bear was plentiful and was killed for meat in a rug. There was an abundance of all kinds of game. Blood-curdling stories were told for years about panthers, how they would scream like a woman in distress to attract their victim to come near. From Through the Years by Leila Lynch. Surprisingly, even as early as the 1890s, men from other places were coming to the Weiner area on duck hunting trips. Some stayed at homes, and later many stayed at the Weiner Hotel. Local men earned good extra money as guides. Game was plentiful then, and hunting did not have the regulations that it does today. In this photograph, George Franklin Leach proudly displays the proof of a good hunt. The year is 1956. This photograph is so well known that even today it is recognizable among duck hunters everywhere. It's simply known as the Claypool picture. T-shirts have been made from the image, and posters adorn the walls of clubhouses and executives' offices. The story of the photo and the day it was taken is remarkable and known by few. Dave Garraway's Wide Wide World on NBC was invited to come film a live duck hunt in Arkansas. With an audience of 4 million households, Wide Wide World offered the chance to tout Arkansas duck hunting like nothing else before. It was crucial that the ducks be there at the precise time as the film crew. Problems were everywhere. Everything from how to hide TV cameras, crews, control trucks, and the necessary workmen, and how to get electricity and telephone lines 2 miles to the woods. This meant using power generators placed far enough back in the woods so as not to disturb the wary ducks. 6 telephone circuits were needed to send the audio part of the program to New York. Camouflaged blinds were built for television cameras and operators, one of which was 40 feet up a hickory tree. With the electronics in place, the only thing left was to make sure that at the exact pre-arranged time, there would be ducks in front of the cameras. Purvis from the Arkansas Game and Fish stated, "I had learned that by leaving one area undisturbed in the vicinity of the picture blind, then driving ducks with boats in open water and using beaters around the edge of the reservoir, that the ducks concentrated in front of the blind." Purvis said, "I thought we could do it again and at a definite time." Originally, the Arkansas duck hunting segment was to be 8 minutes, Purvis said. When they saw no ducks, the New York directors decided to limit our part to 4 minutes. It looked like weeks of preparation would boil down to 4 minutes of airtime. At 1:30 p.m., Purvis set the drive in motion for the broadcast. The ducks began to swim and fly into the staging area by the thousands, Purvis said. New York was watching over the closed circuits. By 3 o'clock, there were 40 acres of ducks in front of the cameras. The directors in New York became enthusiastic and started trimming time off of the other segments of the show and giving it back to Arkansas. All of us were praying that everything would click. At 3:14, the program director in New York pushed a button, and 4 million viewers were looking on. Not another duck could be put on the screen. It was perfect, Purvis said. To add to the excitement, a rocket holding 3 blocks of TNT was fired over the ducks and exploded in midair. Then there was another explosion as 300,000 ducks leaped into the air, Purvis said. With the ducks flying, Wallace Claypool, owner of the reservoir, and Lynn Parsons, a 12-year-old, with his new shotgun, stepped out of a blind. Claypool called the ducks in, 6 shots were fired, and Claypool's dog was shown retrieving the ducks. New York was begging for more. In 1906, J.G. Probst planted a sample of seed in the Weiner Hotel garden using the house pump and a water pail for irrigation. Its yield was so satisfactory that a few interested neighbors became hopeful. Mr. Probst was a real estate agent and was trying his resourcefulness to discover a crop that could be profitably grown in the area to attract potential land buyers from other states. In 1907, W.P. Downing, L. Hogue, W.R. Moyers, and Charles Thompson joined Mr. Probst in a 20-acre venture on the old Wells farm at the north edge of town. However, their 4-inch well could only irrigate 2 acres. The rest had to be abandoned. But the 2 acres produced a yield which was kept for seed. In 1908, larger pumps were installed and run by steam engines. Others joined in the rice experiment. In 1909, larger centrifugal pumps and sawmill-type steam engines were installed by several farmers. The 1909 crops were sacked in 4-bushel bags. A carload was bought by a Lone Oak, Arkansas rice buyer, and the development of the Weiner rice belt was on its way. Rice was harvested with a reaper or binder. Binders cut the grain and tied it in bundles or sheaves. These were stacked into shocks and left in the fields to cure or dry before threshing. Binders were usually mounted on slides because of the wet, rainy conditions and were pulled by oxen, mules, or horses. Horses or oxen were sometimes shod with homemade wooden bog shoes to keep them from bogging down in the fields. Hand cradles were carried along to cut the rice growing on the levees. Miss Leela stated in her book that the threshing crew always ate dinner at the farmer's home during harvest season, and what dinners they were! The farmer's wife was assisted by neighboring farm wives. Then she in turn would go and help them, just as the men helped each other in the fields. The venture into rice growing during the 2 decades following 1906 became an experiment in guesswork, head work, and hard work. Some results were good, and some were disappointing. When farmers learned that old ground played out after 3 or 4 years of intensive rice growing, and that only new and second-year ground produced the best crops, there was a rush to clear woodland. They cut many trees into cordwood to use and to sell. Tree tops, small trees, and underbrush were cut and burned. Large stumps were dynamited, and stumps of little trees were cut off at ground level. The winter season was typically used in this effort. If it happened to be a wet fall, harvest was a burdensome process. If rice fell down in the mud and water, it could not be salvaged except by hand, and if much of a field went down, it was a loss. Often the shocks would have to be revisited and opened up to dry out. Blackbirds feasted on grain in the shocks. In a normal season, it took the grain about 3 weeks to dry enough for threshing. By 1950, most of the timberland was cleared. New ground couldn't be added indefinitely, and the cost of clearing was becoming almost prohibitive for many farmers. With soil depleted by intensive use, and grass a menace, and blight and red rice a problem in some fields, the only avenue to success was learning a new approach. It was then that real science in farming began, opening up an era of successful results undreamed of in those early years. The skyline at Weiner is dominated by the huge rice mills, which naturally followed the success of rice farming. Well over 1 million bushels of rice are milled every year. The tall, impressive structures serve as a visual testimony of the importance of rice production in our community, and serve as a reminder of the hard work and dreams of so many of those early farmers who dared to try something new and succeeded. Looking back, we remember the sacrifice of those who came before us, those whose commitment to one another created a special place to grow up and learn what is important in life. The landscape may have changed drastically over the years, but the values of that time remain true today. Perhaps Albert Einstein said it best. Every day I remind myself that my inner and outer life are based on the labors of other men, living and dead, and that I must exert myself in order to give in the same measure as I have received and am still receiving.